When Emily Benson discovers unsettling signs of her husband Mark's infidelity, her seemingly perfect life begins to unravel. As hidden secrets and emotional betrayals come to light, Emily must navigate the devastating reality of a broken marriage while protecting her family. Mark, desperate for redemption, struggles to regain Emily's trust, but each revelation only deepens the divide. With tensions rising and emotions running high, Emily faces a heart-wrenching decision. Can love overcome betrayal, or is it time to let go? Dive into this gripping tale of love, deceit, and resilience to see how the twists unfold. It was 2009, a quieter time when the biggest distraction was scrolling through a friend's Facebook album instead of an endless sea of videos. In a small, peaceful neighborhood outside Portland, Oregon, the Bensons seemed to have it all. Their house, perched on the corner of a tree-lined street, had the kind of charm you'd find in a home decor catalog, complete with a white picket fence and a tire swing that swayed lazily in the autumn breeze. Inside that picturesque home lived Emily and Mark Benson. Emily was the kind of person people gravitated toward. At 36, she had an easy laugh, a sharp wit, and the ability to make anyone feel at home. She worked part-time as a freelance editor, which let her juggle the demands of their two kids, Ben and Lily, ages 10 and 8. Mark, her husband, was an architect. At 38, he exuded the kind of calm confidence that came from being good at what he did. He'd been at the same firm for years, earning respect for his meticulous designs and dedication. Together, they were the envy of their neighborhood, a couple that seemed to balance love, work, and parenting effortlessly. But, as with most perfect pictures, there were cracks just beneath the surface. The story begins one rainy afternoon. Emily sat by the window, laptop open, editing a manuscript from one of her regular clients. She sipped her tea, occasionally glancing at the clock Mark had texted earlier, saying he'd be home late due to a meeting with a new client. It wasn't unusual. His job sometimes demanded long hours, and Emily trusted him. Why wouldn't she after 12 years of marriage? Mark had never given her a reason to doubt him. Still, something felt off lately. Mark had been more distant than usual, distracted even when he was home. He'd taken to checking his phone constantly, something he never used to do. Emily brushed the thoughts aside, convincing herself it was just work stress. After all, Mark wasn't the kind of man to hide anything. At least, that's what she told herself. When Mark finally came through the door that evening, Emily greeted him with her usual warmth, but he seemed unusually reserved. He gave her a quick kiss on the cheek, ruffled Ben's hair, and went straight upstairs to shower. That was the first time Emily noticed it. The faint smell of perfume that didn't belong to her. It wasn't strong, but it lingered just enough to plant a seed of doubt. Days turned into weeks, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Mark was staying late at work more often, claiming he was tied up with a big project for a particularly demanding client. Emily wanted to believe him, but the inconsistencies in his stories began to pile up. On one occasion, he mentioned being at a late meeting downtown, but when Emily happened to drive by the office on her way to pick up Lily from gymnastics, it was dark. Another time, she found a receipt for an expensive dinner tucked in his jacket pocket. Dinner for two at a place she'd never heard of. One night, as they sat together in the living room after the kids had gone to bed, Emily decided to ask. "You've been working a lot lately," she began casually, her voice steady but probing. "Is everything okay at the office?" Mark looked up from his phone, caught off guard by the question. "Yeah, everything's fine, just busy," he said, a little too quickly. Emily nodded, forcing a smile, but she could feel the distance between them growing. It was subtle, but it was there, a wall she couldn't quite see over. That night, as Mark slept soundly beside her, Emily stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with possibilities. Was she imagining things? Was this just a rough patch they'd eventually work through? Or was there something more? Emily decided to confide in her best friend, Rachel. They met for coffee the next morning at a cozy cafe downtown. Rachel, ever the pragmatist, listened intently as Emily laid out her concerns. "You're probably overthinking it," Rachel said, though her brow furrowed in thought. "But if it's really bothering you, maybe you should talk to him. Get everything out in the open." Emily nodded, though the idea of confronting Mark again made her stomach churn. She wasn't sure she was ready to hear whatever truth might come out. As the days wore on, Emily's unease only deepened. She began noticing more small details. A second phone charger in Mark's car, unfamiliar numbers on the phone bill, and a sudden interest in grooming. Mark had started going to the gym regularly, something he hadn't done in years. He claimed it was for health reasons, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. One Friday evening, after the kids were asleep, Emily mustered the courage to check Mark's phone. She hated the idea of invading his privacy, but the weight of her suspicions was unbearable. She waited until he was in the shower, then unlocked his phone using the passcode she knew by heart. At first, everything seemed normal. Texts from colleagues, emails about work. But then she saw it. A string of messages from a contact saved under the name J. Green. The messages were innocuous at first glance, brief exchanges about meeting times and places, but the tone was unmistakably personal. Emily's heart pounded as she scrolled further, her worst fears confirmed. There were photos, flirtatious messages, and a pattern of late-night communication that painted a clear picture. Mark wasn't just working late. He was seeing someone else. Emily put the phone down, her hands trembling. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her, followed by a mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Mark, the man she'd built her life with, the father of her children, had betrayed her. When Mark emerged from the bathroom, towel draped around his neck, he noticed the look on Emily's face immediately. "What's wrong?" he asked, concern in his voice. Emily stared at him, tears welling up in her eyes. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all she could manage was a choked whisper. "Who is Jay Green?" Mark froze. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the steady hum of the ceiling fan. His expression shifted from confusion to something Emily couldn't quite place. Fear. Regret. Whatever it was, it told her everything she needed to know. Mark didn't answer right away. He stood there, clutching the towel, as if it might somehow shield him from what was coming. Emily waited, her breath shallow, her chest tight. She thought of the years they'd spent together, the memories they'd shared, and now, the painful reality that it all might have been a lie. "It's not what you think," Mark finally said, his voice low. "Then tell me what it is, Mark," Emily shot back, her voice trembling. "Because right now, all I see is my husband sneaking around behind my back." Mark sat down on the edge of the bed, running his hands through his hair. "It's complicated," he began. But Emily wasn't having it. Complicated. "You've been lying to me, Mark. How long has this been going on?" Mark's hesitation spoke volumes. When he finally spoke, his words were hesitant and halting. "A few months," he admitted. "Her name is Julia Green. She's a client. It started out as work, but then..." Emily's world spun. "A few months," she repeated, her voice rising. "You've been lying to me for months, Mark, while I've been here, holding everything together. You've been... what, whining and dining someone else? Making excuses to be away from your family." Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with something resembling guilt, but Emily wasn't sure she believed it. She stood up abruptly, needing space, needing air. She paced the room, tears streaming down her face. "You don't get to sit there and act like this was some harmless mistake," she said, her voice cracking. You made a choice. Mark, a choice to betray me. Betray us. Do you even care what this is doing to me, to our family? I care, Emily, Mark said softly, but the words felt hollow. Emily turned to face him, her heart pounding. If you cared, you wouldn't have done this in the first place. She paused, her voice steadying. I need to know everything, Mark, right? Now every lie, every excuse, every moment you chose her over me. Mark nodded slowly, resigned. For the next hour, he recounted the details of his affair, how it began innocently enough, with late-night meetings to discuss her project, and how those meetings eventually led to something more. Emily listened, her anger bubbling just beneath the surface. She wanted to scream, to throw something, but mostly she just felt numb. When Mark finished, she sat down across from him, staring at the man she thought she knew. I don't know if I can forgive you for this, she said quietly. Mark's eyes met hers. I don't expect you to, he said, but I want to make things right. For you. For the kids. Please, Emily, just give me a chance. Emily didn't respond. She stood up, grabbing her keys. I need to think, she said, walking out the door before Mark could say another word. The following days were a blur. Emily threw herself into work and the kids' schedules, avoiding any serious conversations with Mark. She wasn't ready. How could she be every time she looked at him? All she could see was the betrayal. Mark, for his part, tried to make amends. He came home earlier, helped more with the kids, and even started attending couples therapy, though Emily's participation was half-hearted at best. It wasn't until a chance encounter at the grocery store that things took an unexpected turn. Emily ran into Rachel, who immediately noticed her friend's strained expression. After a bit of prodding, Emily reluctantly shared what had happened. Emily, you don't have to figure this out alone, Rachel said firmly. You need support, whether that's me, therapy, or even just taking time to focus on yourself. But don't let him dictate how you handle this. Emily nodded, realizing Rachel was right. She needed to take control, not just react to Mark's choices. One evening, as Mark sat in the living room flipping through channels, Emily approached him, her resolve firm. I want you to move out, she said bluntly. Mark looked up, startled. What? You need to leave, Emily repeated. I need space time to figure out what I want, without you hovering around, trying to fix things. Mark opened his mouth to protest, but stopped when he saw the determination in her eyes. Okay, he said finally. If that's what you need, I'll go. Over the next few weeks, Emily began to rediscover herself. She reconnected with friends, took up yoga, and even started writing again, something she hadn't done in years. It wasn't easy, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was regaining control of her life. Meanwhile, Mark struggled to adjust to life outside the family home. He stayed in a small apartment across town, spending his days consumed by guilt and regret. He threw himself into therapy, hoping to understand why he made the choices he did and how he could repair the damage he'd caused. Despite the separation, Mark and Emily remained civil for the sake of their kids. They attended school events together, coordinated schedules, and maintained a united front. But beneath the surface, the tension lingered. One night, after dropping the kids off at Emily's, Mark lingered in the doorway. Can we talk? He asked hesitantly. Emily considered for a moment before nodding. They sat at the kitchen table, the silence heavy between them. I've been doing a lot of thinking, Mark began. About everything, about us, about what I did. And I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to be honest with you. Emily crossed her arms, skeptical. Go on. Mark took a deep breath. I was selfish. I let my insecurities, my need for validation, cloud my judgment. It wasn't about you, Emily. It was about me and my inability to see what I had. You and the kids. You're my world, and I threw it all away because I was too blind to appreciate it. Emily listened, her emotions swirling. She wanted to believe him, to believe that he could change, but the scars of his betrayal were still fresh. I don't know if I can ever trust you again, she said finally. But I appreciate your honesty. Mark nodded, his expression pained. I'll keep fighting for us, Emily, no matter how long it takes. As Emily lay awake that night, she couldn't help but replay Mark's words in her mind. Could she ever truly forgive him? Could they rebuild what had been broken? The answers weren't clear, but one thing was certain. Her life, their life, would never be the same. Remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel. If you're hooked on stories like this one, your support helps bring more content to life. The weeks after Mark's heartfelt admission were a whirlwind of emotions for Emily. She had begun to see glimpses of the man she had fallen in love with, his sincerity, his willingness to change. But the weight of his betrayal still loomed large. For every step forward, there were 2 steps back, and the balance between hope and resentment teetered precariously. Emily tried to focus on herself and the kids, but one afternoon, her resolve was tested in an unexpected way. She was folding laundry in the living room when her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. Hesitant, she answered, only to hear a familiar voice on the other end. Emily, this is Julia Green. Emily's heart stopped. She tightened her grip on the phone, her mind racing. Why was Julia calling her? What could she possibly want? I'm sorry to bother you, Julia continued, her tone careful. I know this is unconventional, but I think we need to talk. Emily considered hanging up right then and there, but something held her back. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the nagging feeling that there was more to this story. Against her better judgment, she agreed to meet Julia at a cafe later that afternoon. When Emily arrived, Julia was already seated at a corner table, her demeanor calm but guarded. She looked younger than Emily had imagined, closer to her late 20s, with an air of sophistication that immediately set Emily on edge. Thank you for coming, Julia said, gesturing for Emily to sit. Emily didn't respond right away. She placed her bag on the chair beside her and folded her hands on the table, her expression unreadable. Why am I here? Emily asked bluntly. Julia hesitated, clearly choosing her words carefully. I wanted to apologize, she began. For everything I know, I've caused a lot of pain, and I hate myself for it. Emily's eyes narrowed. If you hated yourself for it, you wouldn't have done it in the first place. Julia flinched at the sharpness in Emily's tone, but she nodded. You're right, she admitted. I let things get out of hand when I met Mark. I didn't know he was married. He wasn't wearing a ring, and he never mentioned you by the time I found out. I was already involved. Emily's chest tightened. Hearing it laid out so plainly only deepened the sting. And yet, you stayed, she said, her voice bitter. You kept seeing him, knowing he had a family. I'm not proud of that, Julia said softly. But I ended things weeks ago. Mark hasn't told you, has he? Emily froze. Mark hadn't mentioned anything about the affair ending. In fact, his behavior over the past few weeks had been so subdued, so remorseful, that she'd assumed it was over. But hearing it from Julia added a layer of uncertainty that Emily wasn't prepared for. No, he hasn't, Emily said finally, her voice cold. And honestly, I don't know if I care. Whatever you had with him, it's over. It doesn't change what he did to me, to us. Julia nodded, her expression pained. I wanted you to know the truth. I thought it might help. Emily stood abruptly, grabbing her bag. The truth. The truth is that you and Mark made choices that shattered my family. That's the only truth that matters." Without another word, Emily left, her heart pounding as she walked to her car. The conversation with Julia had stirred something in her, a determination to take control of her life, no matter how messy the process might be. That evening, Emily confronted Mark. She didn't wait for the kids to go to bed. She couldn't. As soon as Mark walked through the door, Emily stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, waiting for him. "Why didn't you tell me it was over with her?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with frustration. Mark blinked, caught off guard. "What are you talking about?" "I met Julia," Emily said. "She told me everything that she ended things weeks ago. So why didn't you tell me?" Mark's face paled. You met Julia?" "Yes, and now I want an explanation," Emily said, stepping closer. "Why didn't you tell me it was over?" Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because I didn't want to reopen the wound," he said. "I thought telling you would just make things worse." Emily shook her head, anger bubbling to the surface. "You don't get to decide what makes things worse, Mark. You lost that privilege the moment you chose to betray me." Mark's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Emily saw how exhausted he looked. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm sorry for all of it. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to try to make things right." Emily stared at him for a long moment, her emotions warring within her. Finally, she spoke. "If you want to make things right, then stop hiding. Be honest with me about everything." Mark nodded, his expression resolute. "I will, I promise." In the days that followed, Emily began to notice a shift in Mark's behavior. He was more present, more attentive, and, most importantly, more transparent. He didn't just say the right things. He showed them in his actions. He gave Emily the space she needed, while also making it clear that he was willing to fight for their marriage. But for Emily, the road to forgiveness was far from straightforward. She started attending therapy on her own, unpacking the anger and hurt that had been simmering beneath the surface. Through these sessions, she began to realize that healing wasn't about forgetting what had happened. It was about finding a way to move forward, even if the scars remained. One evening, as Emily sat in the backyard watching the kids play, Mark joined her. He sat down beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "I've been thinking," Mark said after a moment, "about us, about what comes next." Emily didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the kids. "And?" she asked. "I know it's not my place to ask, but do you think we have a chance? Can we ever get back to what we were?" Emily was silent for a long time, her thoughts swirling. Finally, she turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I think we owe it to ourselves, and to the kids, to try." Mark nodded, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Thank you," he said softly. "I won't let you down again." Emily's decision to give their marriage another chance set the stage for what felt like a high-stakes balancing act. Trust was fragile, and while Mark appeared committed to rebuilding what he had broken, the cracks in their relationship seemed to widen with every passing day. Emily found herself second-guessing his every move, her mind racing with doubts whenever he wasn't home. One night, as Mark worked late, again, Emily sat in bed scrolling through her phone, her anxiety mounting. She opened his email on impulse, still logged in from months ago. She hadn't checked it since finding out about the affair, but tonight, something gnawed at her. What if there was more he wasn't telling her? Scrolling through the inbox, she saw nothing unusual. Work emails, invoices, and a few generic messages. Just as she was about to log out, an email caught her eye. It was from a name she didn't recognize. Catherine McAllister. The subject line simply read, "Follow-up." With shaking hands, Emily clicked the email. The message was brief, discussing a meeting scheduled for next week. Attached was a PDF labeled proposal draft. Emily stared at the email, unsure what to think. Was it work-related? Was this another Julia situation waiting to unfold? Emily decided she couldn't sit with the uncertainty. When Mark came home that night, she was waiting in the kitchen, the email pulled up on her laptop. "Who's Catherine McAllister?" she asked the moment he walked in. Mark blinked, caught off guard. "She's a client," he said, dropping his bag by the door. "Why?" Emily turned the laptop around so he could see the email. "Then why is she emailing you outside of work hours? And what's this proposal about?" Mark frowned, stepping closer. "Emily, it's nothing," he said. "She's a potential client for a new project I've been trying to land her account for weeks. That's all it is." But Emily wasn't convinced. "You expect me to believe that, after everything, you're still working late with clients who seem a little too friendly?" Mark sighed, clearly frustrated. "Emily, I'm telling you the truth. You can call her if you want. I'll even show you the proposal. There's nothing going on." The tension in the room was palpable. Emily wanted to believe him, but the scars from his affair made it nearly impossible. She nodded curtly, closing the laptop. "I hope for your sake you're telling the truth," she said, her voice icy. As the days passed, Emily tried to push the email out of her mind, but it lingered like a shadow over her thoughts. Mark continued to reassure her, even going so far as to invite her to his office to meet Catherine in person. Emily declined, unsure if she wanted to confront whatever truth might lie ahead. Then came the breaking point. It was a Friday evening, and Emily had planned a quiet night with the kids. Mark had promised to be home by 6, but as the hours ticked by, he was nowhere to be found. His phone went straight to voicemail, and Emily's frustration quickly turned to panic. By the time he walked through the door at 9 p.m., she was seething. "Where have you been?" she demanded, her voice shaking with anger. Mark hesitated, his face flushed. "I got held up at work," he said, avoiding her gaze. "Don't lie to me, Mark," Emily snapped. "I called your office, you weren't there, so where were you?" Mark froze, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was with Catherine, but it's not what you think." Emily's heart sank. "Then what is it? Mark, what excuse do you have this time?" "She's going through a divorce," he said quickly. "We met at a coffee shop to go over her project, and she started opening up about her personal life. I didn't mean for it to take so long, but I was trying to help." Emily stared at him, disbelief etched across her face. "You expect me to believe that you were just helping her after Julia?" Mark nodded earnestly. "Yes, Emily, I swear to you. Nothing happened, I didn't cross any lines." But Emily wasn't buying it. "You crossed a line the moment you decided to meet her outside of work. Do you even realize what this looks like, what it feels like to me?" Mark reached for her, but she stepped back, her voice breaking. "I can't do this anymore, Mark. I can't keep wondering if you're lying to me, if there's always going to be another woman waiting in the wings." Mark's face crumpled, his hands falling to his sides. "Emily, please, I'm trying, I love you, I want to fix this." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "If you loved me, you wouldn't keep putting me in these situations." That night, Emily slept in the guest room, her mind racing. She thought about the life they had built, the promises they had made, and how easily Mark had thrown it all away. Was there anything left worth saving, or was it time to finally let go? The following morning, Emily called Rachel, desperate for clarity. As they walked through the park, Emily poured her heart out, laying bare her fears and frustrations. "Emily," Rachel said gently, "you've given him every chance to prove himself and he keeps letting you down. Maybe it's time to stop waiting for him to change and start focusing on what you need." Emily nodded, the weight of Rachel's words sinking in. "But what about the kids?" she asked. I don't want to break up their family. Rachel placed a hand on her shoulder. Staying in a marriage that's full of distrust and pain isn't good for them either. They need a happy mom more than they need a perfect family. Emily spent the next few days reflecting on her future. She sought advice from her therapist, spoke to her parents, and even confided in her oldest child, Ben, in a way that was age-appropriate. Slowly, she began to see a path forward, one that didn't involve Mark. When she finally sat him down to talk, the conversation was somber, but resolute. "Mark," she began, her voice steady. "I've thought long and hard about this, and I've come to a decision. I think it's time we separate. For good." Mark's face fell, but he didn't argue. "If that's what you need," he said quietly, "I'll respect it." The decision to separate felt like a weight lifted off Emily's shoulders, but it was far from an easy solution. As Mark packed his things and moved into a modest apartment across town, the reality of their fractured family began to sink in for both of them. The kids, though initially confused, adapted quicker than Emily expected, perhaps sensing the tension that had plagued their home for months. Emily, however, was not at peace. Despite the separation, questions lingered in her mind. Was there more to Mark's relationship with Catherine than he had admitted? Was this truly the end of their marriage, or was it another chapter in their long, tumultuous story? Her instincts told her there was more beneath the surface. A week after Mark moved out, Emily found herself cleaning out the garage. It was part necessity and part distraction, an attempt to regain some sense of control. As she sorted through old boxes, she came across one of Mark's gym bags, forgotten in a dusty corner. Without thinking, she unzipped it. Inside were a pair of running shoes, a towel, and, tucked into a side pocket, a folded piece of paper. Emily unfolded it carefully, her heart pounding as she read the words scrawled across the page. "Catherine, I don't know how to thank you for being there for me. You've given me clarity in a way I never thought possible." Mark Emily's breath hitched. This wasn't the kind of note one wrote to a client. This was personal, intimate, a confirmation of everything she feared. The anger she thought had subsided flared up again, sharper and hotter than before. She needed answers. That evening, after putting the kids to bed, Emily called Mark. Her tone was calm, but there was steel beneath her words. "We need to talk," she said. "Face to face." Mark hesitated, sensing the seriousness in her voice. "All right," he replied. "When?" "Tomorrow, my place after work." The next day, Emily prepared for the confrontation. She rehearsed what she wanted to say, steeling herself for whatever Mark's response might be. When he arrived, she wasted no time, pulling out the note and placing it on the coffee table between them. "What is this, Mark?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Mark picked up the note, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition. He sighed deeply, setting it back down. "It's not what you think," he began. Emily's patience snapped. "Don't say that. Mark, don't tell me this isn't what it looks like. You've been lying to me for months, and I'm done giving you the benefit of the doubt. So tell me the truth. For once." Mark ran a hand through his hair, visibly struggling with how to respond. Finally, he spoke. "I wrote that after one of our meetings. It was an emotional time, but nothing physical ever happened, Emily, I swear." Emily stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. "An emotional time," she repeated, her voice rising. "You shared things with her that you should have been sharing with me. You gave her parts of yourself that were supposed to be mine." Mark's face crumpled, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw genuine remorse. "You're right," he admitted. "I crossed lines I shouldn't have. I let myself get too close to her because I felt like I was losing you." Emily blinked, taken aback. "Losing me?" she echoed. "Mark, you didn't lose me. You pushed me away every lie, every secret. It wasn't me who walked out on us. It was you. Mark nodded, his shoulders slumping. I know, he said softly. I know I've made mistakes, and I'll regret them for the rest of my life. Emily's anger began to fade, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Mark, she said quietly. I don't know if I even want to. In the days that followed, Emily wrestled with her emotions. Part of her wanted to believe Mark's remorse was genuine, that he was truly ready to change. But another part of her, scarred and wary, refused to let her guard down. She wasn't sure she could survive another betrayal. Meanwhile, Mark threw himself into therapy and parenting, determined to prove to Emily that he could be the man she needed. He attended every school event, showed up on time for every pickup, and kept his interactions with Emily respectful and transparent. But the damage had been done, and rebuilding her trust seemed like an impossible task. The pivotal moment came one rainy evening when Emily received an unexpected visitor. It was Catherine. Emily opened the door, her stomach tightening at the sight of the other woman standing on her porch, drenched but defiant. I know I'm the last person you want to see, Catherine said, her voice firm. But I need to set the record straight. Emily hesitated before stepping aside, letting her in. They sat across from each other in the living room, the tension between them thick enough to cut. I never meant to cause trouble for you and Mark, Catherine began. But I think you deserve to know the truth. Emily crossed her arms, her expression guarded. And what truth is that? Catherine took a deep breath. Mark and I did have a connection. An emotional one. But it never went beyond that. And when I realized how much it was hurting you, I ended it. I told him to focus on his family, to fix what was broken. Emily's chest tightened. Why are you telling me this now? She asked. What do you want from me? I don't want anything, Catherine said simply. I needed you to know that Mark really does love you. He talks about you all the time. Even when things were complicated, he never stopped loving you. Emily looked away, her emotions swirling. She didn't know whether to feel relief, anger, or something else entirely. I don't know if that makes it better or worse, she said finally. Catherine nodded, standing to leave. I just wanted to tell you my side. Whatever you decide, I hope you find peace. As the door closed behind Catherine, Emily sat in silence, her mind racing. Was it possible to rebuild something so broken? Did she even want to? Emily sat in the quiet of her living room, replaying Catherine's words over and over in her mind. The clarity she had hoped to gain wasn't coming. Instead, her emotions churned in a chaotic storm. Anger, sadness, guilt, and even a glimmer of hope. Was Mark's love enough to rebuild their broken marriage? Or was it simply too late? The next day, Mark called to arrange a time to pick up the kids. His voice was calm, but Emily could sense a nervous undertone. She wondered if he had heard about Catherine's visit, but decided against bringing it up. Instead, she agreed on a time and hung up quickly, not ready for any deep conversations. When Mark arrived later that evening, he lingered in the doorway after the kids ran off to pack their overnight bags. Emily could feel his gaze on her, but she kept her focus on the dishes in the sink. Emily, he began, his voice hesitant. Can we talk? She sighed, setting down the dishcloth. What is it, Mark? He paused, searching for the right words. I know I've hurt you in ways I can never take back, but I need you to know I'm not giving up on us. No matter how long it takes, I'll keep trying. Emily turned to face him, her expression weary. Mark, words don't mean much to me anymore. I need actions, consistency, something real. I understand, he said softly. And I'll prove it to you, even if it takes the rest of my life. Emily wanted to believe him, she really did. But trusting Mark again felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon. One misstep, and she'd be free-falling all over again. That weekend, Emily attended a family gathering with the kids. It was supposed to be a distraction, a chance to focus on something other than her crumbling marriage. But even surrounded by her parents, siblings, and nieces, the weight of her situation was impossible to ignore. Her mother, a sharp but loving woman in her 60s, pulled her aside after dinner. "Emily, sweetheart," she began, her tone gentle but probing. "How are you really holding up?" Emily hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I'm managing," she said finally. "It's been a lot." Her mother placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're stronger than you think, but don't let that strength keep you from making the right choice, whatever that may be." Emily nodded, her mother's words sinking in. Strength wasn't just about enduring pain. It was about knowing when to let go. As the days turned into weeks, Emily began to feel a shift within herself. The constant ache of betrayal didn't sting as sharply, and she found herself focusing more on her own healing. She took long walks, spent time journaling, and even began attending a local support group for women dealing with infidelity. At one of these meetings, Emily listened as another woman shared her story, different in details, but similar in pain. The woman's words struck a chord, and for the first time, Emily felt a sense of solidarity. She wasn't alone in this struggle. The real turning point came during a chance encounter at the grocery store. Emily was browsing the produce aisle when she heard a familiar voice call her name. Turning, she saw Julia, the woman who had upended her life months earlier. Emily's first instinct was to walk away, but something in Julia's expression stopped her. She looked almost apologetic. "Emily," Julia began, her voice quiet. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything." Emily's jaw tightened. "You're sorry?" she repeated, her tone sharp. "Do you have any idea what your actions did to my family?" "I do," Julia said, her eyes filled with regret. "And I hate myself for it. If I could go back and undo it all, I would." Emily stared at her, the anger simmering beneath the surface. But as she looked into Julia's tearful eyes, a surprising realization hit her. Holding on to this anger wasn't serving her. It wasn't undoing the past or helping her move forward. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Emily said finally. "But I also can't keep carrying this around. I just want to move on." Julia nodded, her expression a mix of relief and sadness. "I understand. And for what it's worth, I hope you find happiness, whatever that looks like for you." That night, Emily sat alone on her back porch, watching the stars. She thought about everything she had been through. The betrayal, the pain, the slow journey toward healing. And for the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace. She didn't have all the answers, but she was beginning to see a path forward. When Mark called to check in on the kids, Emily decided to take the conversation in a different direction. "Mark," she said, her tone calm but firm, "I think it's time we talked about the future." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Mark responded. "I'm listening." Emily took a deep breath. "I don't know what the future holds for us, but I do know that I need time to figure out what I want and who I want to be. For now, I think we need to focus on co-parenting and healing individually." Mark's voice was quiet when he replied, "I understand, and I'll do whatever it takes to support you." Over the next several months, Emily and Mark worked to establish a new normal. They attended therapy separately, and as a family, prioritizing the well-being of their kids. While their romantic relationship remained uncertain, their ability to communicate and co-parent improved significantly. For Emily, the journey was far from over. But as she sat on her back porch one evening, watching her kids play in the yard, she felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was finally ready to take the first step. In the months that followed, Emily found herself gradually reclaiming her identity. She wasn't just a wife or a mother. She was Emily Benson, a woman with her own dreams, her own strength, and her own story. The separation from Mark, though painful, had given her the clarity and space she needed to reflect on her life. Mark, for his part, had thrown himself into being a better father. He attended every school play, every soccer game, and spent weekends doing projects with the kids. He still held out hope for reconciliation with Emily, but he respected her boundaries, giving her the time and space she had asked for. One day, while walking through the local park, Emily ran into Rachel. They hadn't seen each other in a while, and the reunion felt like a warm embrace. "You look lighter," Rachel said, smiling. Emily nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I feel lighter. It's been a long road, but I'm finally starting to feel like myself again." Rachel linked arms with her, guiding her toward a bench. "And Mark?" Emily hesitated, then sighed. "He's trying, he really is, but I'm not sure if I can ever see him the same way again." Rachel nodded thoughtfully. "That's fair. Sometimes rebuilding doesn't mean going back. It means moving forward, in whatever way works for you." Meanwhile, Mark continued his therapy sessions, confronting the mistakes he had made and the insecurities that had led him down such a destructive path. For the first time, he began to understand the depth of his actions, not just their impact on Emily, but on himself as well. It was humbling and painful, but it was necessary. One evening, after dropping off the kids at Emily's, Mark lingered at the door. "Emily," he said hesitantly, "can we talk for a minute?" Emily looked at him, her expression neutral. "Sure." They sat on the porch, the cool evening air wrapping around them. Mark took a deep breath before speaking. "I just want to say thank you for giving me the chance to still be in the kids' lives, and for not giving up on co-parenting with me. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful." Emily studied him for a moment, her heart softening just a little. "Mark, I didn't do it for you. I did it for them. But I can see you're trying, and that matters. For what it's worth, I hope you find peace too." Mark nodded, his eyes misting over. "I hope you do too." As time passed, the wounds of their marriage began to heal. Not completely, but enough for Emily and Mark to find a rhythm that worked for their family. Emily focused on her writing, finally finishing a novel she had started years ago. It was a deeply personal story, one that allowed her to process her pain and find closure in a way she hadn't expected. The kids, resilient as ever, adapted to their new normal. They split their time between Emily's and Mark's homes, maintaining a sense of stability and routine. They didn't fully understand the complexities of their parents' relationship, but they felt the love and care that both Emily and Mark continued to give them. The final chapter of their story unfolded on a sunny afternoon. Nearly a year after the separation, Emily hosted a barbecue at her house, inviting friends and family to celebrate the kids' birthdays, which were just a week apart. Mark was there too, helping set up tables and grill burgers. As Emily watched him laughing with the kids, she felt a pang of bittersweet emotion. She would always care for Mark. He was the father of her children after all, but she had made peace with the fact that their romantic relationship was over. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the kids were asleep, Emily and Mark sat together in the backyard, the glow of string lights casting a warm ambiance. "I think we did good today," Mark said, smiling. Emily nodded. "We did. The kids were happy. That's all that matters." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, before Mark spoke again. "Do you ever think about what could have been?" Emily looked at him, her expression kind but firm. "I do, but I've also learned that sometimes love isn't enough. We were good together once, but we've both changed, and that's okay." Mark nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. I just want you to be happy, Emily. Whatever that looks like. I want the same for you, she replied. And for the first time in a long time, they both felt at peace with where they were and where they were going. Final thoughts. Emily's journey wasn't one of easy answers or fairy tale endings. It was messy, painful, and filled with uncertainty. But through it all, she rediscovered her strength and learned the value of putting herself first. Mark's path, too, was one of growth and redemption, though it came with its own set of challenges. Their story wasn't about finding their way back to each other. It was about finding their way forward, separately, but still connected through the family they had built together. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more recaps filled with drama, suspense, and emotional twists, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Your support keeps these stories coming. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.